That's not fair. Maybe you heard that, especially in leadership, when you work with your coworkers, talk to your boss. You might consider a decision as fair or not fair. The problem is we don't really know where it comes from, or do we, when we consider something fair or not fair? And today we have an expert here who exactly knows where it comes from. Hello and welcome, Graham Jones.
Hello, Niels.
Thank you very much for taking the time, and I'm getting straight into the topic. Where does it come from that we consider some things as fair and some things as not fair? Because it seems quite random and often based on my personal opinion rather than the facts. What would you say is the case? Where does it come from to say when someone says it's fair or not fair?
Well, the basis of fairness comes from deep-rooted psychology about how we protect ourselves and survive. So a lot of psychology is about survival instincts, because if we don't survive as individuals, then eventually the human race disappears. Yep. And so the brain is trying to make you survive. And of course, if things are unfair, if things are unequally distributed, or there's any kind of unfairness, it actually reduces the potential for survival, because there could be fights, there could be, attacks, there could be all kinds of consequences of that unfairness. So our brain actually drives us to want fairness because it helps us survive.
When we now look into the business world, let's say most companies have an interest that you attract talent, that you win talent, that you develop and retain talent. So delivering fair leadership should be in their personal interest. However, you just have to look on glassdoor.com and you see it is rather the exception than the rule. How is it possible that so many leaders have a wrong perception of what is considered as fair and not fair?
Partly that's because of the psychology of leadership. How do those people who get into very senior positions get into those senior positions? And there are certain personality types that are more likely to want to become leaders. And those personality types tend to not have as much fairness, what you might call distributed fairness. Their perception of fairness is really about them as an individual. And so they're much more individually focused, and therefore their brain is seeing fairness from their own perspective. Whereas people who don't have those personality types are seeing fairness from a group perspective.
So when does it start when we perceive fairness? Is it something we get to learn when we're 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? When do we really develop a concept where we can use the term fairness properly?
Well, it's very young. In fact, there's some recent research from the University of Washington, which was looking at 16-month-old children.
Wow.
And remember, 16 months, you've only been walking for about 3 or 4 months. So you're very unsteady on your feet. And you're only just beginning to make the sounds that will eventually become language. So these are children that don't have language. They're still in the beginnings of acquiring language, and they can only just about walk. And yet the University of Washington research showed us that actually they understand what's fair and what's not fair. They did a fairly sophisticated experiment about demonstrating to the children some videos of equal distribution of toys and things and unequal distribution. And they were then measuring the reaction on a touch screen for what these children were doing to what the children thought was right and what they thought was wrong. And most of the children gave rewards to the people who were distributing things fairly, and they punished the people who were distributing things unfairly in the videos. And so that shows us that even at that age, before they can speak, they know what's fair.
Wow, that is very impressive. So when we now say certain leaders don't have the right perception of fairness, is it possible to teach them, or do organizations have to expect that a certain percentage of your leaders will simply act in the wrong way?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a wrong perception of fairness. It's just that their perception of fairness is focused on them as an individual. So they're still having the same biological process, as it were, in terms of what's fair. But their perception of that fairness is about them as an individual, whereas other people who may be not making it into those leadership roles because they are perceiving what's fair more from a group perspective. So it's about teaching those people who have a very individual focus, those leaders who are really focused on themselves. It's about teaching them the value of a group and the value of other people, helping them make decisions, helping them achieve things, so they can begin to see everything from a group perspective rather than from an individual perspective.
Isn't it the case when you have certain leadership types in an organization? Let's say most organizations are unfortunately still normally led from a rather male board. There are numbers available where you see that diversity is still reasonably low, and especially when, for example, you look at a sales team, you still have sales rock stars, the rock star in the company, etc. Isn't career, which might be wrong then, of course, isn't career more focused on look at these rock stars rather than look at the group? I mean, anyone talks about, of course, when they get an award, they always say, I wouldn't be anything without my team. Still, they didn't act that way at all before.
Yeah, they say I wouldn't be anything without my team. So that's already personal focused rather than team focused because of that very wording of what they're using. But the point about diversity is really interesting. One thing we know, as you say, that the number of, say, female leaders is much lower. When you look at the top companies in the world, they are largely all led by men. And when we look at those companies where there is greater diversity, the companies that have greatest diversity have the highest productivity in their sector. They have the what you might call the greatest distribution, the fairness of distribution of salaries and other benefits within the organization, and they tend to be more profitable. And so one thing we know, comparing companies within sectors, the ones that are led by highly competitive rock star kind of leaders actually don't perform as well. So greater diversity dramatically improves your performance in business. And one of the things about greater diversity is that it helps people see fairness in a different way. They are, because of that diversity, the perception of fairness becomes greater. And so the fairer we are, the better we perform as a group of people.
So that will mean, because especially today when people are pitching their business to look for investors, even an investment banker, which normally has a really bad reputation on the market out there, they are all looking for diversity, often because they say companies do better when they are more diverse. So it sounds a bit cloudy what they say, but actually investors and even investment bankers are right with what they say in this case.
What that diversity is better for the performance of the company, absolutely. But they don't. Often, a lot of these companies are just ticking the box. So
that will be my next question.
so, for example, there was a campaign here in the UK. I think it must be about 4 or 5 years ago now, to increase the number of females on the boards of the FTSE 100. And the idea was that, several of them had male-only boards. And so what they wanted was 50% of the FTSE 100 to increase the numbers of females on their boards. And apart from the fact that they failed to reach that target in a few years, those that did so by appointing one woman. So you've got one woman on a board of, 10 men.
Yeah.
And so actually they still haven't got it. They still haven't understood the fairness of the diversity. And that's because those people on the board are the people who perceive fairness from an individual perspective. They find it very difficult to see the equity of the fairness of having, more and more women, more and more ethnic minorities, all the different kinds of diversity on their board, because they're seeing it from an individual perspective. So one of the key things we need to do is to help people understand the value of groups compared with the values of individuals. We see this, of course, when we compare different parts of the world. So, for example, Asia, very dominated by group thinking and family thinking, whereas America, much of Western Europe, very dominated by individual thinking. So there's a cultural element to this as well as to what we perceive as fair.
It seems to be a very complex issue because when you look at the boards, especially in the UK, and I'll just take the UK, when you look at FTSE 100 boards, most people on these boards are highly educated. Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, you name it, they have the degrees, they have the background. So highly educated people still do it the wrong way. So it obviously is not the key to give people better education. How is it possible? And of course, very good education is important, no question about that. But how do I teach people the value of the group when even the highest and most educated individuals obviously don't get it or don't want to see it, depending maybe on their network? So how do I teach people the value of the group when high level of education does not seem to be the key in this case?
Well, obviously, the high level of education is important. You can't run a multi-billion-pound organization if you're not very well educated. So clearly education is important, but then we need to look at the education. Is the education diverse? And a lot of those universities are not as diverse as they themselves would like to be. And that's because of the application process. And so, you can trace this back. So here, Oxford and Cambridge desperately trying to become more diverse in their student body, but those people who could apply to those universities are not wanting to apply because they don't see them as diverse. So actually positive discrimination is one thing that can help here. And I know that's a great can of worms for people to discuss, as it were.
Yeah.
But actually one of the things you can do for those boards of, Harvard, Stanford, educated people.
Affirmative action, yeah.
Yeah, is to get them into groups of diverse people, and then they experience it and realize the value. So it's about maybe organizing events and so on where they are part of a group of people that is a diverse group of people, and they will begin to see the benefit of that diversity, and then they will start doing things.
So when we now look at these attempts that people try to be more diverse, and now I'm opening a real can of worms here. What do you think of the idea of having a quota where you simply say on the board 30% must be, let's say, female?
Well, quotas, as you say, are another can of worms.
A massive one.
Yeah. I'm not in favor of quotas. I'm much more in favor of people realizing they need to improve by experience. So one of the key things, so I lecture at university, for example, and one of the things we do with our student groups is if we say to a group of students on a group project, you go off and form a group, we allow them to do that sometimes, but then we can see that the groups they've formed are groups of very similar individuals. And so they don't see the benefit of working with diverse individuals. So every now and then we will mix it up and we will force them into groups. So we will put students from very different backgrounds, from different cultures, from different nations together in one group. And initially they don't like it because it's not their kind of preferred group. But actually, by the time they finish the project, they're all talking about how wonderful it was that the different experience from these different cultures and different ideas that were coming in was working. And so then later, when they do other projects, they will actually start forming groups with people from outside their cultural fix, as it were, because they then have already experienced the benefit. So I think the more we do that in education, the better. But the more we can do that at work. So rather than saying we have a quota of people, inevitably more and more people from diverse backgrounds will be part of our teams and part of the boards of business, the more they experience the value of working in those groups. So we may need to force people into groups, as it were, within the workplace, so they experience that greater diversity for it to have the impact. But if we have a quota, then people will they will inevitably form, if we've got a 30% quota of people from a particular cultural background that we want in, those people will form a mini group on their own, as it were.
Yeah.
And so you won't actually get the benefit of that diverse group working together.
So we need a bit of force in the beginning, because let's face it, isn't that what some universities will not like, because let's face it, alumni networks are hugely focused on keeping, let's say, certain universities. I'm not going to put any names in here, but alumni networks normally were very keen on keeping certain people in certain powerful positions in certain organizations from one generation to the next one. So these alumni networks actually are, from a scientific point of view, although they are driven by universities, counterproductive from a scientific point of view. Is that correct?
They're counterproductive in terms of that diversity and fairness. But actually, a lot of universities are using those networks to drive new students to their university, because those alumni are then recommending students to apply. And the whole thing then reduces the level of diversity of the application to universities. So that means that those business people who are being educated in those big universities inevitably are going to meet people very similar to the people who are alumni.
So when people are now listening to this podcast and think, I think, especially when I look at the science, we need to do something about fairness, diversity in our organization. But maybe people are not on senior leadership level when they're listening to this right now. So to round this interview up, what are Graham Jones' top 3 tips on how to get started in an organization which is not very fair, not very diverse in a group kind of sense? What are your top 3 tips how to get started?
My top tip is that if you were put into, asked to do a project or asked to work on something, I would look for people outside your usual group that you would go to help support you. So I'd look at other people in the organization, look at people from different cultural backgrounds, and your project will benefit from that. So the first thing is start mixing it up yourself. So that would be the first thing. The second thing I would do is I would do a bit of research and look at the evidence. So in your sector that you're working in, there will be research available that will show you, the businesses that are doing better than others, and you'll begin to see that those businesses may have are more likely to have more diverse people in the organization. And so they're having greater fairness, as it were, within that organization. So that would be the next thing. And then my third tip would be always treat other people the way you would expect to be treated. And I think that promotes greater fairness within the organization. Sometimes people treat others in the workplace in a way they think that person ought to be treated based upon cultural position. Whereas I think if you treat other people the way you would expect to be treated, then we've all got greater fairness in the workplace.
I think these are perfect final words for this podcast. Of course, I'm going to put your contact data in the show notes of this podcast so people can get in touch with you directly. At the end, there's only one thing for me left to say. Graham, thank you very much for your time.